Well, welcome everybody. Good evening to those of you who, like me, are in the New York East Coast of the United States. Good morning to those of you who, like our speaker, Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik, is joining us from Southeast Asia, and it is very early in the morning. My name is Anne-Marie Murphy, and on behalf of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University, the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Seton Hall University, the Southeast Asian Network, and the APEC Studies Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to this webinar on Malaysian foreign policy towards the United States. This evening's talk is the part of a 7-week conference series called Southeast Asia Views America, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects. The full conference series is in the chat if you'd like to look at it. And this series aims to assess the tenor of bilateral relations between the United States and major Southeast Asian countries at the start of the Biden administration. President Biden, as you all know, has claimed that the United States is back, and in contrast to his predecessor's unilateral and transactional American first foreign policy, Biden has sought to reassure Southeast Asian leaders of the United States' commitment to multilateralism and renewed engagement with U.S. allies and partners like Malaysia. At the same time, however, strategic competition with China is a defining feature of Biden's foreign policy. And this has led many Southeast Asian analysts to fear that the new administration will view Southeast Asia largely through the lens of Sino-American rivalry, rather than as independent states in their own right, and pressure them to choose sides. The series, therefore, features prominent Southeast Asian analysts and seeks to explore the regional perspective on the opportunities and challenges for bilateral relations as the Biden administration begins its efforts to engage U.S. allies and partners like Malaysia. And to help us understand how Malaysia views the United States and what the future for Malaysian-U.S. relations might be, we're extremely fortunate to have two of the leading experts in the field with us tonight. Our main presenter is Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik. He is an associate professor and head of the Center for Asian Studies, the Institute for Malaysian and International Studies at the National University of Malaysia. He's also a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute, and he was previously a postdoctoral research associate at the Columbia-Harvard China in the World program. Dr. Kuik's research focuses on small state foreign policy, Asian security, and international relations. And beyond his academic expertise, Dr. Kuik served as head of the writing team for the Government of Malaysia's inaugural defense white paper. So he brings not only academic expertise, but deep insight into the Malaysian foreign policy making process tonight. So we're extremely lucky to have him. And we're also fortunate to have as a discussant, Alina Noor. Alina Noor is director of the Political Security Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute and Deputy Director of the Institute's Washington, D.C. office. Alina's work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance, technology, and preventing countering violent extremism. So the way we're going to proceed is that Dr. Kuik will make his presentation in Ambiguities of Alignment, the Politics of Malaysian-US Relations. After that, I'll invite Alina to make some comments before opening it up to Q&A. The Q&A function is open, so you can put your questions in anytime. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the screen, not the floor, over to Dr. Kuik.
Thanks very much, Professor Murphy and Marie, for your very kind introduction. And good evening or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are. Let me first share my screen. I have only 6 slides. And let me, I hope you all can see the slides. All right. When Anne-Marie first contacted me and assigned me this task to speak about Malaysia-US relations, and she was also letting me know that she had Elina nor in mind as a discussant. So I thought to maximize the benefits that I could get from this session, because both Elina and also Anne-Marie are experts on the subject matter. So I thought that perhaps I should not only talk about Malaysia-US relations, I should also try to use this just as a case to relate to something wider, which is how and why smaller countries in Southeast Asia and perhaps elsewhere respond and also position ourselves as US-China rivalry is deepening, as more and more actors in and out of the region are revolting, strengthening their partnerships in many ways surround the Indo-Pacific notion or construct. So here I have chosen to highlight the word alignment. I've decided not to talk about hedging because of both Anne-Marie and also Elina perhaps have heard and read too much about the notion of hedging. So I thought I would talk about alignment. And this is the core of not just academic issues, but clearly is also a policy issues. For example, Biden administration come to power and then externally highlight about the importance of underscoring the US alliances and also a partnership. So the word alignment clearly capture both alliances and also partnerships. And I shall elaborate what are the distinction and why I think that Malaysia-US relations, even though it's not an alliance, it is a form of alignment. However, and this is my main argument is that Malaysia-US partnerships is a form of alignment that is ambiguous in many ways. And this is mainly because of a number of structural and also domestic reasons. And to that end, let me illustrate and also back up my main argument with 3 points, 3S, shadows, spectrum, and also shades. And as you could see, clearly these are the 3 main reasons that explain the ambivalent partnership between Malaysia and also US. But I think it also speaks to many other smaller countries' position vis-a-vis the United States, but to some extent also China and other powers. So the first factor, shadows from the past, is really about the historical and also structural reasons that explain why we have been very cautious in a number of ways. And this is related to the second factor of risk. I think more often than not, we know that especially for actors outside of Southeast Asia, many have taken the position that I think the risk is all about China threat. China is a threat and alignment with like-minded nations is the solution. So I think within Southeast Asia, we are a little skeptical because we clearly, of course, see China-related risk, but there are also many other type of risks internally and also externally that have driven but also limited our positioning vis-a-vis US and also other powers. So this is something that I thought need to be emphasized in order to understand Malaysian and also Southeast Asian countries' perspective. So it's about risk, perception of risk that have to be understood along spectrum. It's not dichotomy. And then this brings me to the third and also the final factor, which is about shades of gray. And meaning that things are not straightforward, not black and white. And alignment can take many forms. And Malaysia's form of alignment with the United States is one of, as I said, if I can only use one word, I will use this word to capture the nature of Malaysia's alignment with the United States, and that is ambiguous. And in fact, just a few days ago, I had a conversation with our mutual friend, Kavi from Thailand. Kavi jokingly, when he heard about my point about shades of gray, he jokingly said about, oh, for Thailand, we have 50 shades of gray. And I think I agree with him. And I would only say that perhaps for Malaysia, we do not have 50. Thailand is a master of hedger. We are perhaps not as sophisticated as that, but I think perhaps we have 20 or 30 shades for the reasons that I'm going to elaborate. With that, and before I bring to the 3S, I think it is worth to spend a little bit of time to talk about why I think that alignment is the word to describe Malaysia-US partnership. And then the next slide, I will explain why this alignment is one of ambiguous. So here I try to make a distinction between alignment and also alliance. I think we all know that the United States has two treaty allies in Southeast Asia, Thailand and also Philippines. So what distinguishes alliances from alignments? Alliances clearly is about military cooperation between two or more countries that involve mutual defense commitment. Alignment might not necessarily involve a mutual defense commitment. It's mainly for consultation for other partnerships. But in my view, alignment is something broader. It is, of course, an interstate cooperation. And when it comes to defense or strategic alignment, it needs to have a few elements, defining elements, which I try to highlight it by bolding it. You could see that all alignments have to be founded on considerable converged interests. The deeper the converging interests, the stronger the alignment. But it shouldn't be just about converging interests. It has to be about three other elements that would define and also characterize the patterns of the alignment. So first element is about institutionalized cooperative mechanism. So it has to be institutionalized. It cannot be ad hoc. So in the case of Malaysia-US relations, I have two examples here. The two countries actually signed a defense arrangement back in the 1980s, and it was Mahathir, none other than Mahathir, who actually made that decision, not once, but twice. And it was during Cold War period, but also post-Cold War period. So the first one was BITEC, a bilateral training and a consultative group, back in 1984. He made a trip to the first trip to the United States as Prime Minister in 1984, and that's in January 1984. And at that particular same year, we signed that agreement for training and also other purposes, military cooperation. And even when Cold War ended, we actually also entered into other arrangement as ACSA in 1994, which has been renewed in the subsequent decades. So that's an institutionalized cooperative mechanism that define a Malaysia-US alignment. And this is also complemented by few other elements, for example, high-level consultative processes. So alignment has to involve a high-level and high-level consultative. So in this case, Malaysia-US strategic talk in 2008, it's a form of a mechanism that define and also support the Malaysia-US alignment. Finally, we could also see that all these institutionalized mechanism, consultative processes also give rise to extensive collaboration. Malaysia-US partnership, defense security partnership, has been very, very extensive, covering all key areas of the defense and security sectors. For example, military exercises like CARAT, for example, training education like IMET, and also various kind of capacity building programs, assets transfer, so on and so forth. So these three parameters are the very elements that define and explain why Malaysia-US partnership, it's a form of alignment, even though it does not involve mutual defense commitment. Unlike, for example, in the case of AMDA, Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement, that was signed in 1957 and lasted until 1971, when it was replaced by FPDA, another consultative arrangement. So all these elements have given rise to interacting, long-standing interactions, which bring about aggregated the benefits in many ways. Aggregated benefit, for example, into the non-traditional security cooperation, aggregated benefits that spill over to Coast Guard, MMEA, and also even, of course, economic and other arrangement people in many ways. Let me now move on to the next slide to explain why, despite all this extensive and long-standing cooperation between Malaysia and United States, this alignment has been and will continue to be ambiguous one even under Biden administration if the current circumstances continue. So ambiguous in many ways, but three are the most important. It's asymmetric by a power structure between the United States and also China, United States and also Malaysia. And that's quite straightforward for all other smaller countries in Southeast Asia's relationship with Uncle Sam. For example, I think very recently, our Foreign Minister Hisham Mudin has, of course, to make a request to and also wait for the queue to have a chat with Secretary Blinken, and that's very much asymmetric in nature. And asymmetric would also means that United States' attention to Southeast Asia will always be perhaps a benign and neglect in one way or another. And the second aspect would be is ambivalent. Ambivalent in the sense that it is quite contradictory about our outlook towards the United States. On the one hand, we see US as indispensable partner in terms of economic, in terms of security. And that was during Cold War period, despite the fact that we didn't maintain an alliance relationship, and this continued to be so. In fact, the more power rivalry is growing, the more we would want to maintain our long-standing strategic partnership with the United States. But on the other hand, we also see some risks and also challenges from United States, either in terms of the actions, either it's intended or otherwise in many forms. And this might not necessarily about, it's not about strategic, but it's more about the economic aspect and also the political aspect. Elina's earlier work has made it very clear to us that, for example, we were affected by US action during the Cold War about the policy which affected the price stabilization of certain key commodities for Malaysia. At the time it was rubber and tin, but even today, I think the palm oil industry certainly it's also affected by a big powers action or limit for one reason or another. So we have this kind of ambivalent relationship. And of course, during the 1990s, the UNWA, the reformasi issue has also deepened the kind of ambivalent in the sense that United States could pose political challenges to the ruling party or ruling coalition of the day. And clearly during Najib's time, this thing continued to play a part on the ambivalent, even though US importance as the economic and strategic partner continue to deepen and also in fact widen. And so because of all this asymmetric and also ambivalent nature of the relationship, our policy actions have naturally been one of subtly selective. Selective in the sense that, number one, it's deliberately kept under the radar. One good example would be Najib's visit to Washington, D.C. In 2002. He was invited to give a talk at the Heritage Foundation. He wanted to talk about US-Malaysia Defense Partnership. His original title was actually Malaysia Defense Partnership, a well-kept secret. But eventually that was replaced as a solid success story. But for a long time, Malaysia's very close defense and strategic partnership with the United States has been under the radar for mainly domestic reasons at the earlier phases. And ruling elites in Kuala Lumpur and now Putrajaya do not want to elaborate or highlight too much in the open, so it has continued to be under the radar. Of course, today, there are some external reasons of not highlighting too much. And in fact, if we do talk about it, we also make sure that there will be something counteracting, the opposite actions in order to offset these consequences and so dynamics, which brings me to the next point. Malaysia has always been taking not only middle position between US and China, but also opposite position. Opposite position in the sense that sometimes we might be contradictory. For example, when US requested to use our airspace and also a sea space for foreign reason, we did that. But later on, when China made similar requests, we also made some similar arrangement in order to underscore that we are not taking sides, to underscore the point that we are doing and developing our strategic defense partnerships, not necessarily with anyone in mind. And again, I don't think Malaysia is unique. I think many other ASEAN countries have something similar. So there have been a number of deliberately contradictory action because of sometimes contradiction is necessity. And hence the result is Malaysia's approach has always been selective and at times active and also adaptive. Selective in the sense that when it comes to capacity building, those that are less sensitive will be very receptive. So when United States want to help us to enhance our defense capability, assets, and on certain areas like even like the maritime domain, I think we would do that. But if going over that would touch upon something too sensitive that might be perceived as we are targeting someone, some power, I think we have always been very, very cautious. And again, as I said, Malaysia is not the only one. And there are indicators and also examples to show that we have been at times, not all the time, active and also adaptive. Active in the sense that, for example, the one example that I mentioned earlier on, Malaysia-US strategic talk, it was actually Malaysia's initiative. We were the one who actually proposed to Washington, D.C. Let's have this more institutionalized high-level mechanism. So we also took initiative on a number of other programs. It's not always like United States that come to us. Sometimes we also take the initiative to forge collaboration with the United States, and similar approach can be said about our approach to vis-a-vis China. And then adaptive would be, I think there are many examples, but one good example would be about Copra Gold. Malaysia used to be just an observer of this exercise, but as tension and also possibility of conflicts arise and over the South China Sea, we have also decided to be adaptive and accepted the invitation to be a participant and not just observer of Copra Gold. So with that, let me use the next 3 slides to illustrate my 3 remaining points, reasons that explain why Malaysia's defense arrangement and also the partnership, the alignment with the United States has always been and is likely to continue to be ambivalent. So the first reason is about shadows from the past. Malaysia's history is a history of big power politics. We don't have time to elaborate any of this, so I just left the number and also the events there. But I think every Malaysian will remember 1511, 1824. 1511 in the sense that the Portuguese arrived, and that's marked the fall of Malacca Sultanate, and then in a way, it also marked the beginning of Western colonization in this part of the world. And Malaysia was kind of quote unquote lucky to be colonized not only by one, but in fact 3 Western powers after Portuguese, Dutch, and also British came. And the 2 powers, competing powers of the day back then, after a while decided that let's make a deal. 1824, the Dutch, Anglo-Dutch treaty actually decided make a deal that resulted in, I would say, the present day the territorial, the political map, territorial of Malaysia and also Indonesia, 1824. And then 1941, of course, during the Second World War and also the Japanese occupation and all that. And more recently in the Cold War period and also post-Cold War, you see Red China pose the internal and also external threat, confrontasi by Indonesia, backed by Beijing. And then you have UK's East of Suez, when UK, the long-standing for 14 years, our ally decided for their own internal reasons, they have to retreat it from Southeast Asia, East of Suez. They had to do so. And alliance that we have been relying upon for so long is no longer with us. So that clearly poses a risk of abandonment. And clearly it's in the memory of Malaysian leaders in one way or another. And we also remember that US Nixon Doctrine in 1969 added to that kind of risk of abandonment. So the lessons that we learned from all these historical incidences is such that big powers would come, they might not go, they would stay. Big power attracts other competing powers, and power will compete for domination in one way or another. And as the receiving ends, smaller countries, we cannot stop them. These are all structural. It's top-down, it's systemic. But we would be facing the consequences in one way or another. Sometimes even big powers do not intend to harm us. They might still harm us in one way or another because of the power competition, because of the big power gap between us and also them. And big power sometimes would make a deal, as I mentioned, 1824. And I think this is something that, again, in the mind of many smaller countries in the present day. And finally, we also learn from East or Suez, for example, that you can put all eggs in one power or one side's basket. But when that particular big power pattern, for their own reasons, domestic reasons, clearly, when decided to retreat or reduce the commitment, there is nothing much we could do about it, right? And all these structural realities and also consequences doesn't mean that smaller countries therefore are giving up, we are completely powerless, precisely because of all these realities and also challenges. I think smaller states realize that we always have to be active, and also we must have some degree of a smaller state agency. And clearly, Malaysia has made our own choice adjusting to the changing structural and domestic conditions. So to cut the long story short, we have seen Malaysia's alignment choices and also alignment position have evolved or transformed. It's never dynamic, it's never static, but always a dynamic. So earlier on, as I mentioned, AMDA, Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement from 1957 to 1971, it's a one of clear-cut alignment. We put all eggs in the UK directly with the US, even though we didn't join Sudo for a number of reasons. But clearly at that time, from 1957 to 1971, is a clear-cut alignment. We align with the West, vis-a-vis the communist threat, China, but to some extent also Soviet and also Soviet-backed Vietnam. But once East or West, once US reduced the commitment in mainland Southeast Asia, we have had to adjust or abandon the clear-cut alignment to one of non-alignment. So non-alignment, regionalization, regional neutralization, all that became the main thrust of Malaysia's approach from 1970s onwards. And with what is going on with ASEAN and also ASEAN-based institutions, and including all the ASEAN Plus with many layers of partners, these have allowed Malaysia, just like other ASEAN countries, to actually pursue something I would call as multi-layered alignment. Even though officially, openly, we emphasize about non-alignment, but in reality, if you look into our actual actions and many layers of actions, in reality, I would really think that we have been aligning in one way or another without forming alliances. And then I know this can be controversial, but I do welcome questions and also perhaps a request for clarification, perhaps during the Q&A. And with that, let me move on to spectrum of risk. As I said, risk in eyes of smaller countries is not like just about one risk. It's not just about like China related risk, but there are many other spectrum of risks. Some are non-traditional security, some are traditional, and it's always from various actors. It's not just from Beijing or from South China Sea or in one way or another. Many partners also challenge or pose a risk in one way or another. And then there are also kind of a pressure, maybe in the form of economic sanction or economic action to punish us in order to shape our policy choices. And then the very issue of big power entrapment and abandonment, all these are part and parcel of structural risk that is in the mind of Malaysian and also Southeast Asian leaders. And as the US-China rivalry continues to deepen and widen, when there are talks about decoupling, when there are talk of not only talk but also actions where Southeast Asia as a geopolitical region is becoming crowded. I think there are many books on this topic coming out last year, right? For example, by Murray, from David Chambal, Don Emerson. All these, I think, highlight some of these structural risks, even without using those terms, very, very clearly. So these are clearly not an academic issue, but very much a policy issue. But my whole point here about spectrum of risk is that although structural risk is well aware by many writers and also analysts, I think domestic risks are clearly more important in many cases because of you get something, you have to give up something, or there is a price, there is no free lunch. So there are some consequences from alliance. For example, alliance allow us to maximize security and economic benefits, but at what price? There will be some erosion of sovereignty. There will be some erosion of policy independence. When big powers patron want you to take some position or choice on issues that they care about the most, you cannot say no. And this pose a big domestic risk because it might result in grassroots resentment. It might harm a regime interest. It might even harm leaders' survival in one way or another. So a spectrum of risks would natural call for spectrum of solutions or approaches, which bring me to my last slide, my last point. I think policy choices really is about shades of gray. It's about spectrum, many shades of colors. Some would say gray. Even gray, there are different. Some are more deeper, darker than the others. So the key points here is that when we talk about or describing policy choices or solutions as shades of gray, what we mean is that number one, policy choices are rarely black and white. It's not like to join an alliance or not to join an alliance, to join an alignment or to not to join an alignment. It's to what extent and in what way we choose to align with one power along with the others. And it's seldom straightforward. It's not like the one size fit all. With one alignment, we can solve all the risks and all the problems. I don't think this kind of ideal approach exists in the reality. And all choices, policy decisions involve a trade-off. You will maximize security, you have to surrender some aspect of autonomy or internal sovereignty, so on and so forth. Is the risk, the challenges justify that? Are your people ready to accept that? I think ruling elites make their own choices, right? I think we could see from Duterte and also many other leaders' decision. And that brings me to my last point about the driving and also the limiting factors underpinning Malaysia's ambiguous alignment with the United States. So structural conditions about asymmetries, rivalries, and uncertainties will continue. In fact, it would also deepen. As I said earlier on, with the rise of Indo-Pacific construct, I think we are going to see more and more dynamics of US, China, and in fact, a big power rivalry are going to be more open, more intense, and more dangerous. Even though smaller countries do see some opportunities, some countervailing powers to constrain and also attract China's action in South China Sea. Malaysia clearly, Malaysia's risk perception about China clearly has been on the rise as well, even though in public we don't talk about it. But since 2013, as China deepened its presence in South China Sea as close as 50, 60 nautical miles from our shore, we clearly become more alarmed. So we do welcome, even though we don't talk about it, some presence of stronger countervailing force to constrain China in one way or another. But there is a distinction between constrain and contain. We welcome constrainment, but none of us would want containment. Because of containment, when it happened in the way, especially what happened during Cold War, again, Southeast Asia as a region of smaller countries, we will be the first to suffer. So we are very nervous, very ambivalent about these structural dynamics. And this will continue as more and more powers are involving, not just in the high politics domain on South China Sea and maritime security. We have seen that not just about Quad members doing that, individual Quad members. We're also seeing, for example, EU as individual powers. They've also come up with their own Indo-Pacific strategy. EU as a group in September would also come up with a document. And we would anticipate UK, Canada would join the fray in one way or another. And as I said, smaller countries see this ambivalent in a very ambivalent way. There are opportunities, but there are more and more top-down challenges. So my final point, Anne-Marie, I'm sorry for taking longer than I expected, will be about domestic reasons. So smaller countries, Malaysia's position vis-a-vis a big power, in this case, United States, have more often than not about leaders' own calculation about their own survival and elite legitimation. We have seen different kind of pathways and also approaches for elites to justify and enhance their domestic authority, to enhance their legitimacy. But in the case of Malaysia, and again, all other ASEAN countries, the first pathway has always been the primary, development-based performance legitimation. So here, US has always been playing a key part. As I said, US has always been a key economic partner in terms of trade, in terms of investment. But today, things are changing. US no longer among the top trading partner of Malaysia. Still continue to be the top 3 investor, but there are many other economic benefits that Malaysia and other countries hope to get more from US and also other competing powers. But today, I think we do see that in the long run, it seems like what the US and other competing powers are bringing to our table when it comes to development-based performance legitimacy is getting less. Identity-based, other approaches like identity-based and procedural-based are important too. Sometimes they deepen the rationale of performance legitimacy, sometimes they constrain. I think a good example, and again, I think Elena's earlier work helped us to understand how identity-based, for example, the Malay interest, special rights actually constitute a political barrier for Malaysia-US bilateral FTA negotiation, and even TPP, it was also some constraint as to the extent and also the way in which Malaysia ruling elites, regardless of which government, could go. And procedural would be about the democratic aspect and also win the election. With that, I know that the time is running out. I would stop here. Back to you, Anne-Marie.
Well, thank you very much, Cheng-Chwee. That was extremely comprehensive and extremely interesting, the opportunities and the constraints. But before I start talking anymore, it is Alina Noor's turn to make some comments. Alina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for having me. It's so wonderful to be sharing the screen with someone like Cheng-Chwee and offering some comments on what he's just said. It's almost like something is amiss when I don't hear Cheng-Chwee mention the word hedging. So, but Cheng-Chwee, I think you may start to carve out a niche for yourself by talking about gray zone policy making. People always talk about gray zone operations in the maritime domain and the cyber domain, but I think you may have something going here with all this talk about shades of gray. And so maybe you can write a paper on gray zone policy making with the case of Malaysia. The other thing I'll say for those who don't know Cheng-Chwee is that he, apart from being a master of hedging, he is also a bit of a master in his alliterative abilities. So in that spirit, let me try to keep up and offer 4 points, all starting with the letter A. So this program is being brought to you by the letter A today. First point relates to this idea of ambiguity and ambivalence that Cheng-Chwee talked about. And just listening to your comments, Cheng-Chwee, I wonder why you went with the term ambiguous rather than ambivalent, even though you spoke of both quite extensively in trying to explain Malaysia's approach to its relations with the US. Does it make a difference whether Malaysia's ambiguity is or is not more than its ambivalence? And if so, what is that difference? Because they have very similar connotations, but they are also quite distinct. And the case that you raise about the TPP negotiations and the domestic constraints that the Malaysian government faced in its relationship with the US, particularly when TPP negotiations were going on, I think shows this ambivalent nature of Malaysia's ties with the US. So on the one hand, on the ground, you had massive resistance and protestations towards and against this idea of Malaysia joining the TPP negotiations. But on the other hand, you also had the Malaysian government that was very much aligned with the US's goals in trying, at the time, in trying to get the TPP signed and ratified. Of course, we all know how that story ended. But I think that particular example of TPP negotiations showed just how ambivalent Malaysia's approach was to the US, and this distinction between on-the-ground sentiments and elite sentiments, and how sometimes these can have very real impacts in terms of policy, but also the practical relationship between both countries. I wonder also with Malaysia's ambiguity, whether, and Cheng-Chwee, you touched upon this somewhat, but I wonder if maybe you could elaborate more on whether this ambiguity gives rise to the risk of miscommunication in terms of wrong signaling. Because, and forgive me for saying this, but I think Americans will also accept this, but Washington, D.C. is not generally known for its appreciation of nuance or even tolerance and patience of nuance. And so this ambiguity or ambivalence, however you want to term it, can sometimes come across as time wasting and a little too gray for the taste of those who prefer black and white in Washington, DC. And so I wonder how much of our ambiguity in Malaysia will contribute to what I'll later explain as this further acceptance of Malaysia's desire to continue with an under the radar type of relationship with the US. Second A relates to abeyance. And I think despite the fact that we have had the US-Malaysia Comprehensive Partnership in place for going on 7 years now, there hasn't been much that has built upon that partnership since the Obama administration. Over the last 4 or 5 years in particular, a large part of that has been due to, I guess, what some may term as the Trump administration's unpredictability in its handling of its foreign relations. And obviously in the past year, COVID exigencies have precluded a closer relationship between, not only between the US and Malaysia, but really in the bilateral, multilateral relationships of many other countries in the world. But you see in the US-Malaysia relationship, this abeyance across the board, across the political, security, and economic realms. And Cheng-Chwee, you laid this out quite well, I think. And you gave the example of the phone call between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Hishammuddin, which only happened last month, at the end of last month, actually. It's not wholly unsurprising because if you look at the calls that Secretary Blinken made to Southeast Asian foreign ministers or his counterparts in the region, the Malaysian call was preceded by calls to treaty allies, but also Vietnam and Singapore and even Brunei. Brunei, of course, is chair of ASEAN this year, and so perhaps that was warranted. But I wonder if that this late call in the day, whether it goes to show something more about the prioritization of Malaysia in DC's eyes, not only now, but also for the next 4 years. In the past, we did have a strong economic relationship with the US, of course, largely buoyed by foreign direct investment. But since COVID, with a number of high-profile American multinational companies choosing other countries instead, I wonder if Malaysia's location as an FDI port of appeal is also starting to recede in the eyes of American investors. And I think also that partly due to this lack of nuance in DC, Malaysia is sometimes viewed as having almost turned to the Chinese camp. And you know, I hear these remarks in an offhanded, informal manner. And Malaysia is not seen as critical to the US strategy in Southeast Asia in the same way that Indonesia is because of its sheer weight and heft, not in the same way as Singapore is because of Singapore's closer alignment, defense alignment, particularly to the US. And certainly in recent times, not in the same way as Vietnam is being seen by the powers that be in DC. But, and this is my third A, I think it's afforded Malaysia the sense of agency, and Cheng-Chwee talked about this benign neglect by the US of Malaysia specifically. But this has allowed Malaysia to pursue its own, what you call multi-layered, and I would say issues-based alignment approach. So in that sense, it's offered us that independence of action and policy. But, and this is my final A, how long can this policy of ambiguity or ambivalence be accepted, particularly on the part of the US? Right, so this question of acceptance. In the last 4 years, we saw a more muscular US foreign policy. And there were murmurs of the US behind the scenes, almost forcing Malaysia to choose. Obviously, this was not publicized, but there were rumors that this was happening. And so moving on into this Biden administration now in its 100th day and over the next 3 years or so, can this policy continue to sustain under this administration? We will have congressional elections in the US next year. In the event it doesn't go the way of the Democrats, there will be continued pressures, perhaps, to maybe revisit the nature of this under the radar relationship that we now enjoy, Malaysia now enjoys with the US. And of course, there is that overarching layer of the US-China strategic competition, which puts even more pressure on this under the radar relationship. Malaysia will continue to be seen, I believe, not for Malaysia's sake, but as perhaps a pawn that needs to be moved on the chessboard, however the US and China interact with each other. And so given not just domestic pressures in the US that may or may not come about in the next few years, but also this larger regional dynamic between the US and China, what do you think will be the acceptance of this muted relationship that the US and Malaysia has so far continued to, I would describe it as enjoy? So let me stop there. Thank you.
Wow, you guys are both great with the A's and the alliterations. This is fascinating. Cheng-Chwee, do you want to make some responses to Alina's 4 A's?
I think that's, I think we are all inspired by you, Mary, because of your name begin with A, right? So we try to defer to you by referring to A. So I think it's a good idea to for me to respond to Alina's very, I would say, comprehensive and also very tough comments. And before I got kind of blurred in preparing my response to her, I think it's good for me to respond to her right away and in reverse order. The last point that she mentioned about how long can this ambiguous policy last? And I was smiling as she went on to elaborate that question, because clearly her elaboration already provides an answer to this question. And the answer to that question, how long can this ambiguous policy last, really does not depend on smaller countries, does not depend on Malaysia. It depends on 3 big factors. And each of them will constitute with determine the process and also the outcome and also our policy choices. Number 1, it really depends on US-China interaction, right? And this is something that neither Washington or Beijing or anyone could tell what will happen to these most important bilateral relations between the 2 powers. We know they are continuing to compete, not only in security military chessboard, but also on the non-military economic and many chessboard, and more will come. So, but we do not know whether or not that this will result in intensified competition, but without confrontation, or confrontation or some form of conflict will happen. When competition will continue without confrontation, I think this ambiguous policy will continue. It's not panacea, but it's a second best policy, because of it's not up to us, right, Alina? It's not up to anyone, whoever, however strong the leader is in Southeast Asia, because if US and China go to conflict, when competition escalates into conflict, I think game over. Game over in the sense that even though a smaller country might say that we do not want to choose, we want to continue to hedge in one way or another, it's not up to us, because it's not up to us that they would, US or China would just take actions without asking, right? Like what happened in history. So that's point number 1. It's a structural issue. It's not up to us. Secondly, and this is something that your elaboration illustrates so well, it's about US own action. US own action, again, now with Biden, we know that America is back. We are very kind of receptive about this. But back in our mind, everybody, right? And this is not just Southeast Asia, even US partners and allies are also thinking, what would happen 4 years later? Some would say that what will happen not 4 years, but 2 years later, right? Will this kind of greater commitment to US alliances and partnership continue forever? Nobody, and really will US come to help us no matter what? I don't think any one of us can say for sure. And if you have that uncertainty, you will continue to be ambiguous about it because of you can't burn the bridge. You can't put all eggs in anyone's basket because the price alternative will be too high. And thirdly, third factor will be about China, right? I think Joseph Nye is the one that who say that nobody can contain China. Only China can contain China, meaning that it's up to China. If China aggressiveness continue and offend and threaten everyone in the region, then what choice do we have? At the moment, we do see things ambivalent, not just about US, but also ambivalent about China, right? On the one hand, China provided the kind of developmental benefits that we all need, infrastructure, Belt and Road, so on and so forth, and also public health, COVID vaccine and all that. But on the other hand, I think China's action does not make us to have more confidence or trust. I think the recent ICIS survey clearly illustrate that China has a big problem in Southeast Asia, and that problem is trust deficit. So these three factors will be the determining factor as to whether, for how long and in what way our ambiguous policy will last. So the other, your other questions, I think, would be elaboration or related to this, in the sense that because of that uncertainty, and we would have no choice but continue to make all we could. Beijing is about work for the best but prepare for the worst, right? You do not just prepare for the worst. That's actually the secondary. The primary is work for the best. And this is what I think Putrajaya in Washington. Now in US, we have a new US ambassador, Brian McPheeters, here in Malaysia. And he make it very clear that Washington wants to upgrade the Malaysia-US strategic partnership. And Muhyiddin responded in one way or another. And then there are news that Hishammuddin will make a visit to Washington, and perhaps even Prime Minister might make the visit to Washington for internal and external reasons. So those are efforts or indicators that smaller countries will always be active in grabbing the opportunity when there is a window opportunity, even or precisely because of things are uncertain. And then the other points about like ambiguous, it's dangerous because of people might not see it very clearly. We might misinterpret, so on and so forth. You are right, Elena. But what choice do we have, right? Because of we simply cannot make any black and white policy, and hence this ambiguity dynamics will continue, and hence that explain the final aspect of you invite me to make a distinction between ambivalent and ambiguous. So ambivalent is about the perception, our outlook about all big powers, US, but also China. Ambivalent in the sense that there are perception about opportunities, but there are also perception of risk that they might harm us, they might help us. So it's ambivalent outlook in that sense. But ambiguous is wider than that. In addition to ambivalent, ambiguity is wider than ambivalent in the sense that is other than ambivalence, there are also elements of selective, right? And that's the key of ambiguity. Selective sending different signals. And that is needed under uncertainty in the sense that, as you mentioned earlier on, multi-layered alignment is about issue-based alignment. So issue by issue. So, and also timing play a part. So our policy towards US has always been deliberately selective, ambiguous as a result. For example, as we continue to enhance and widen our defense, long-standing defense partnership with Uncle Sam, sometimes when Uncle Sam proposed something that we see there are some risks, we will say no. One good example would be 2004, when US say that because of the piracy in Strait of Malacca, US said, you guys cannot handle this, right? The littoral states cannot handle this by your own. I'm here, I have the capability, and now I have the will. And then Malaysia and Indonesia was like, thanks and no thanks, right? Different from Singapore, we said thanks and no thanks, despite our very strong, robust defense partnership and trust with the US, because of we learned from shadow of the past, right? Big powers might come, they might not go, and we'll be in big trouble externally and internally. So that's one good example. And also ambiguous also in the sense that sometimes we have to do something contradictory. So on the one hand, as we welcome during Obama's pivot and also rebalancing. I think Malaysia has really transformed and upgraded our relationship with United States in more than one way, especially defense. And with the rising danger from South China Sea, at some point, Hishammuddin, right, at the time he was the defense minister, he was even announced that we want to establish a marine base and marine center in Bintulu and modeling after United States and all that. Of course, macam tak jadi, lost momentum. But then at the same time, you also see around the period that Malaysia has done something ambiguous, sending a wrong signal or done something contradictory by also upgrading Malaysia-China defense arrangement around the same time, in the sense that defense cooperation between Malaysia and China is one of the least developed, but it was around the same time that we tried to send a signal to China that, well, we are developing our stronger relationship with the United States, but this is not targeting at you. And the only way for us to do that is to enhance our defense cooperation with China, even though there is a big, it's pale in comparison with the US-China dynamic, but again, it's something that is considered as needed. I will stop here. Yeah. Sorry, it's a very long answer to Elina's question, but because of Elina's questions are very tough and nuanced questions.
Okay. Well, I'd like to remind our audience to please put some questions in. Cheng-Chwee, I'm going to ask a question. And maybe you can give me a 60-second or less answer, which is part of the reason I organized this project was because it seemed as if everybody in the United States was viewing Southeast Asia solely through that prism of Sino-American rivalry. And yet so much of what you've said today is that Malaysia's policy towards the United States, its ambiguity, its ambivalence, etc., is driven because of Sino-US rivalry, those structural factors. So the question is, can we think of Malaysian-US relations outside of US-Chinese rivalry?
And Marie, you're very spot on. And since you only give me 60 seconds to answer this, I would say that yes, that's actually the desired policy process from smaller countries' perspective. Southeast Asian countries has always been signaling to Washington, D.C., right, that we want United States to see us beyond just one single issue. After September 11, US sees us primarily like a counterterrorism. We see that we have many other extensive interests beyond counterterrorism. So we try to, but somehow this signal is not interpreted very clearly. And now it's another issue of a China issue. So we felt uncomfortable that when US pursue or come to us offering some benefits and possibility, but we interpret that I think what is driving a US policy is all about China, China, China. And we got very, very uncomfortable. And as if like China is the only problem, or South China Sea is the only problem, which we are clearly seeing in a very ambivalent, ambiguous way. So if US is doing, Biden administration's Southeast Asia policy is doing exactly what you have just said, Anne-Marie, I think meaning beyond China and beyond South China Sea, of course, you need to do that as well, but clearly other aspects are important. I think that would be a welcome, and that give more room for smaller countries like Malaysia to actually partner with the United States. So we do see some mixed signal as well. I think we put we turn the table around. We also see some mixed signal from Washington, D.C., right? So on the one hand, we do understand that US has emphasized that you want to do much more. So we welcome, for example, US Build Act, the Blue Dot Network, and that signal that the US try to go beyond South China Sea. You are also trying to compete with China, providing some alternative on infrastructure development that has been appealing to us. So I think we welcome that. But again, the signal is not strong enough and not clear enough, because after announcing that those initiatives 2018, 2019, this is 2021. What really are on our table? I think that's a big question.
Yeah. Okay. I'm I'm going to ask another question or so before I get to the ones in the chat, because I really want to try to unpack the South China Sea issue. Cheng-Chwee, you opened your talk saying that the basis for any alignment is converged interests. And when I look at the South China Sea, it seems as if there's a number of divergent interests between the US and Malaysia. So the US always says that its key interest is freedom of navigation, right? The US wants to reserve the right to fly, sail, and operate anywhere that international law allows. In contrast, the Malaysian interest is in protecting its sovereign territory, protecting its right to resources under EEZ. So it seems as if there's this divergence of interest there. And even when we get to freedom of navigation, the US wants to view that as an explicit right enshrined in UNCLOS and other international law. Whereas at least when he was prime minister, Dr. Mahathir, made some statements that, well, Malaysia has a keen interest in freedom of navigation, but the Chinese have never compromised that. We don't see them attempting that, and therefore we're okay with it. So even when the two agree on freedom of navigation, it seems as if there's a diversion of perspectives there. So is that assessment correct? Is it wrong? And how might this divergence of interest complicate Malaysia-US cooperation in the South China Sea issue?
It's very correct, Anne-Marie. Again, it's very spot on, touch on the core issue. So here you have clearly highlighted that it's not only converged interest, but also diverging interest. So back to the earlier conception, right? So if all or primarily say 80-90% about converged interest, this alignment is going to be unambiguous one. It will be very clear cut. If we enjoy considerable higher converged interest, but precisely because of converged interest is only a part of the relationship, but there are also other diverging interests, and that diverging interest in South China Sea and many other aspects are the one that explain why this alignment has to be limited, ambiguous, and also selective. So your question quoted the phone-op as an example, and I think that is a brilliant example. So that is precisely one key issue that illustrates the converging and diverging interests between Malaysia and US. You are right. I think both countries, US and China, do overlap and enjoy converging interests in seeing open and free navigation as the policy ends. No question about it. But the divergences, it's about the divergences is in terms of the approaches, the means to achieve that, right? Malaysia's policy, and this is not just like under Najib, it's a Mahathir 1.0. About South China Sea has always been that military tool, of course, is an essential. And that's why he signed with Uncle Sam BITEC and also ACSA and all that. But I think from Malaysian, from other smaller countries' perspective is that military tool cannot be the principal or the only tool to manage the South China Sea or territorial problem for a number of reasons that power gap, we are very weak and small, and also territorial dispute that by nature, South China Sea issue by nature is complicated. Malaysia, I think Elina's true writing and also comments highlighted a lot about geography, right? So because of a geographical situation and also history, Malaysia is at the center of so many territorial problems, and South China Sea happened to be one of it, of course the toughest, but we also have many other bilateral territorial problems with virtually all our neighbors, right? And there are fellow ASEAN members.
I know.
And we can't solve that if we can't even solve the bilateral with ASEAN family members, let alone South China Sea. So you just need to manage it. And how to manage it? Phone-op by US, by others, is part of the equation, but it cannot and not necessarily by the biggest part. So if you request to use our airspace and all that, we would do it quietly, allowed, but also allow China. And at the same time, we emphasize that this issue can only be solved through or managed through international law, through bilateral diplomacy. And I do think that this has been part and parcel of what we mean by multi-layered alignment. It's not either or, it's a spectrum. You need to do it together in order to offset, because why? There is no one-size-fits-all policy, no ideal policy. Yeah.
Well, can I follow up, because we have a question from Kaya Bourne at Seton Hall. You know, I already kind of touched on part of her question, but what she asks is what recommendations would you give to the US on the South China Sea? What policy does Malaysia want to see most? So clearly you mentioned phone ops as one tool. You mentioned bilateral negotiations, etc. Obviously, the US is not a party to those disputes, and it's not a member of it's not a signatory to UNCLOS. So those two things complicate its ability to participate in negotiations. Is there one or two short recommendations that you would make to the US?
And okay. That recommendation would be actually Anne-Marie's solution. Anne-Marie, you were the one who early on mentioned that the possibility of Washington, D.C. to actually broaden, right? Go beyond China, go beyond South China Sea. There are many other aspects of a domain of collaboration where US, Malaysia, and US Southeast Asia can enlarge and deepen our converged interests. Let's deepen the converged interests, and those converged interests go beyond South China Sea and China. There are many other capacity building, infrastructure development, public health, vaccine, and also things that for domestic legitimation reasons, ruling elites in Southeast Asia meet and look upon Washington, D.C. But D.C. policy so far has not given a clear and certain signal. Especially, we are also very worried that what will happen after 4 years. I think this is perhaps the largest challenge for everybody. And again, and that brings me back to Elina's earlier question, right? It's not up to us. It's not that Southeast Asia want to send an ambiguous signal, but what choice do we have, right? What will happen after 4 years?
Okay. So we have a question from Mimi Noor Atif Binti Ahmad Daud. And she said, good morning, Mr. Kuik. You mentioned that Malaysia has been engaging in a multi-layered alignment. And you also mentioned the non-alignment policy that has been introduced since the premiership of Tun Razak. And she asks whether Malaysia's non-alignment policy can be considered as a true non-alignment policy. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up to that question, which is, does Malaysia, it seems to me, uses its historical non-alignment, which was not really a choice, right? It was something that Malaysia had to adopt after the British, moved east of the Suez. But when I look at Malaysia's use of non-alignment, it often seems very strategic, right? It's part of the nuance that Alina mentioned. And my question, just to build on this one, is how strong as a constraint on Malaysian foreign policy is non-alignment? When you look at Indonesia, Bebas dan Aktif, the free and active policy, is a very strong constraint, and some analysts argue a barrier to strategic thinking. This desire to row between two reefs, maintain equidistance. Does non-alignment exert a similar constraint on Malaysian foreign policy thinking, or is it something that elites bring out to single ambiguity as part of your ambiguous alignment strategy? How does that all fit in?
Yeah, very good question. And I would say I agree with every point you mentioned. And I would only perhaps describe non-alignment as the motive rather than constraint. It's actually the motive that drive Malaysia's approaches and multi-alignment. It's the results of this. And if and to elaborate on that, and also to for me also to address Mimi's question. Hi Mimi, it's about non-alignment, also multi-alignment approach. Is that non-alignment? Anne-Marie, you're right. It's Malaysia actually choose. It was a decision. We choose to started to embrace a non-alignment only after we realized that complete alignment, meaning alliance with AMDA and also the West, is no longer, it helped a lot in the past, like for example, in tackling confrontasi, right? I think Malaysians like to joke about without AMDA, without UK and also Commonwealth force, Malaysia perhaps already been ganyang by Jakarta, right? So we know what happened. So AMDA alliance played that part, and when the threat was certain and also straightforward. But after that, when British and also with the Nixon doctrine and all that, we knew that we are in a very different strategic scenario. So you're right, Anne-Marie, we had to choose to join and embrace a non-alignment as a result of we were in a situation in which we need to find a new formula to replace the old formula of alliance or complete alignment, because of it's no longer possible. It's no longer, it was not us who choose to stop alignment or complete alliance or complete alignment. We had to, it fall upon us, which is why I keep emphasizing that it's structural. But we need to accept it at a new formula at that particular time. It started actually since late 1960s. Tun Dr. Ismail Tun Raza at that time was still not in the top echelon. It was Tun Abdul Rahman. But at that time, there were already some new thinking that, look, during confrontasi, Malaysia actually was very isolated. Many countries in the developing world did not see us as part of them, right? We are in big trouble. So, so that all these reasons added to the impetus for non-alignment, which is why 1970, 1971, we joined alignment for the first time and continue until today. So there was a policy shift. Resulted because of the changing structural conditions and also domestic after 1969. But so today we still officially proclaim and emphasize that Malaysia is non-aligned. And that has two meanings, right? One meaning is that we are a member of NAM, now non-aligned movement officially. So it's a nama khas, but nama general term is that it's a non-aligned in the sense that we do not want to align with any powers. And that was reflected by the regional neutralization that Malaysia proposed, pushed very hard, and Zokfan was the watered down version of it. And today we don't talk about Zokfan, but I think the spirit that policy actions still carry on. So I do not see non-alignment and multi-layered alignment either or. They go hand in hand. They go hand in hand in the sense that non-alignment is the policy position, it's the reflecting of membership in non-aligned movement, and it continues to underpin and guide and motive. It's a motive, right? Meaning they motivate our policy approaches and choices towards big powers actions and also initiative. But part of the process and also the approaches, the means is that we also need to be not just passively non-alignment, right? But we need to be actively, and that's your favorite word, Anne-Marie, active and passive. So we need to be active in cultivating multi-layered alignment, which was not possible during the Cold War period because of the East-West confrontation, but it was made more possible after the end of Cold War, and especially after ASEAN begin to able to establish ASEAN-based institutions one after another with ARF, APT, and also EAS, ADMM+. So multi-layered alignment was has been built upon all these many layers of policy approaches. Is not either or, but multi-layered.
Okay. Perhaps I'm going to try to link that multi-layered non-alignment to Elena's earlier comment about nuance and how Washington isn't always appreciative of nuance, right? My Southeast Asian interlocutors see a lot of problems to be managed, and they always complain that the US wants to come in, solve something, be done, and go on, right, to the next problem. So there's a difference in perspective of how one handles things, right? Do you solve it? Is it a long-term management problem? And so, Elena, as a Malaysian living in Washington, I'd love to get your perspective. Obviously, what drove your comment to Cheng-Chwee about whether there is going to be a continued appetite, tolerance, I'm not quite sure what word to use, in Washington for the ambiguous alignment. What are your views, and how do you see the relationship?
That's a really good alternative A word, Anne-Marie, appetite. I use the word acceptance. Maybe I need to stop with this alphabet game. So several points. I think one is the need for self-reflection on the Malaysian side. Anne-Marie, you mentioned this earlier. Beyond looking at the region, Southeast Asia, through the US-China prism, if I can reframe your question, it's basically, what is the region's value proposition? And I think this is the challenge for Malaysia. What is Malaysia's value proposition beyond, as we saw in the early 2000s, the issue of terrorism, where Southeast Asia was supposedly the second front in the global war on terrorism, and now beyond China. And as Cheng-Chwee was speaking, I was trying to provide some answers to this question, and I find myself actually at a bit of a loss. In the past, maybe we could talk about Malaysia having the necessary labor skills to offer to interested American investors. We see now sort of a diminution of that appeal for whatever reason. Beyond trade and investment, what are Malaysia's advantages to the political and security relationship? So I think this is something that Malaysia needs to reflect on quite a bit in terms of trying to be proactive in advancing the bilateral relationship with the United States. And part of this, I think, is reflected in the Blinken-Hishammuddin call at the end of March, where if you look at the readout from Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, the conversation seemed to revolve more on regional issues rather than a bilateral relationship. And I think this says something about the state of the bilateral relationship. And it's incumbent upon Malaysia to, again, try to, perhaps in some ways, and on some issues, not all issues, sell our value proposition. First, we have to identify what that is, of course. But I think as a Malaysian being in DC, I have to be honest, I'm constantly frustrated, exasperated, even resentful of the fact that a lot of Malaysia's, first of all, not even really discussed. The hot countries in the region that are discussed in Washington now, as you probably know, Anne-Marie, are Indonesia and Vietnam. Malaysia rarely gets a mention, and if it does, it's almost in a dismissive manner. This speaks, I think, to the larger issue of America not being able to see Southeast Asia for its own sake. This is a constant Southeast Asian complaint, but also specifically in the case of Malaysia, I think this abeyance that I mentioned in the relationship has really contributed to the degradation of what value lies in the US-Malaysia relationship now, beyond the larger strategic competition lens through which everything seems to be seen.
Well, that's a task for the folks in Malaysia. Cheng-Chwee, on that question briefly, as somebody who headed up the team writing the defense white paper, do you think that Malaysia has an answer to its value proposition outside of regional issues and Sino-US rivalry?
Certainly, let me first make a caveat. Our role is only for the writing part, and that clearly it's a teamwork and also a larger, I would say, ministry has its overall tradition and also a consideration and all that. So that's the first point that I want to highlight. So writing team is just doing works that writing team would do. So that's the first point. And then to answer your question, also relate to what Elena has just mentioned. I think I like the word that Elena used about the Malaysia's value portion. And I think that comes back to what Anne-Marie, you mentioned about the converged interests, right? So converged interests is really the areas where Malaysia and US should now we have a greater will, both from Washington, DC and Putrajaya, to enhance and I would say substantiate the so-called US-Malaysia Strategic Partnership that was signed in 2014 during Obama's visit to Malaysia. And now I do think we do see some signals in the sense that, for example, when Ambassador Brian McFeeters, I think on the first day when he arrived, he highlighted a number of things, but he did highlight about three areas which should be the focus. And this is something that Malaysia and US enjoy, converging interests. And without using those words, but what he meant is that those will be should be the areas that both countries should identify even clearer and also come up with the steps to how to go about it. And these three domains are, number one, security, defense, and then secondly, about economy, and then the third is about people to people. And this has always been like the three main pillars of Malaysia-US relations. But even though they are converging, but I think much more can be done, right? Much more can be done. And then this is where I think Anne Murphy's solution will come in. When US has really demonstrated and also come to us with the concrete arrangements or proposals that would substantiate each of three areas beyond, say, China or strategic aspect. I think that would clearly empower Asia-US relationship and make it even more institutionalized. And the key to uncertainty, to managing uncertainty, would be to institutionalize. So more should be done before there are new rounds of uncertainties kick in.
We only have a few minutes, and there's a question or two on domestic politics. And I wanted to just raise this issue because obviously, Cheng-Chwee, you mentioned that domestic legitimation is a key driver of Malaysian foreign policy. Alina, in your discussion of TPP, you made a distinction between kind of public opinion from below and then elites wanting the TPP. So as we think about domestic politics in the US-Malaysian relation, what exactly matters? You know, Cheng-Chwee, you and a series of co-authors wrote a piece for ISIS in which you said that many Malaysians were welcoming of the Biden administration, that they viewed democracy as a key glue binding the two countries together, that in multi-ethnic, multi-religious Malaysia, there was strong enthusiasm for Vice President Kamala Harris because of her background and what she represented. I mean, when we look at this issue of kind of domestic politics and values, is there anything substantive there, or is that what the public diplomacy people write in the, you know, memorandums of understanding? Are there really those kind of ties and common values, not converged interest, but converged values that bind or not?
Yeah, a short answer would be certainly those the democracy aspect and all that are among the main foundations for bilateral relations between US and China, but it's not straightforward. So public opinion also matters more in one way or another, depending on the context and also the timing. If we are focusing primarily about the current ruling cohort, Muhyiddin Perikatan Nasional Government, look, this is a ruling class which do suffer procedural legitimacy, right? It's not through electoral processes. So precisely because of that, he or his ruling group will have to rely even more on performance, legitimacy, and also identity base. At the moment, his government, I think, Elena, you please correct me on this issue. His government is a like Malay dominant group, so I think he's okay with that, and that's actually a big source of his legitimacy and support, especially within the Malay segments. But identity itself would not strong or sufficient enough for him to say win the upcoming election, which we do not know when. So performance will be the key. So public opinion of him, of Perikatan Nasional as a group will rely heavily on the performance legitimacy. And that performance will be primarily in two aspects. One is the economic growth. Economically, we are not doing very well, right? And then also his performance in handling the pandemic. At the moment, you see some good news, but there are still many bad news. So I think his policy choice is towards Washington or even elsewhere would be judged primarily on who and to what extent having some collaboration in whatever domains will help him score high points on performance legitimation without harming the identity and procedural aspect. So hence, when he has some briefing space the last few weeks and the coming months before the next election, right, there will be the game changer. He will need to, he had been visiting a number of places, right? Indonesia, Brunei, and then Middle East, and he's going to visit China, Japan, South Korea. And I think it makes sense for him to visit United States, at some point. That would also underscore we are strengthening our cooperation with, say, China and other countries, but doesn't mean that we have departing from the non-alignment or independence policy.
And maybe just a quick 60-second on the follow-up on that. How did Malaysia respond to the Quad's announcement of 200 million vaccine distribution to the region? You know, some countries like Indonesia viewed it as, well, thank you, but it's really kind of bribery. We are not that enthusiastic about it. How was it perceived in Malaysia, since presumably that would be something that could enhance the Prime Minister's performance legitimacy?
I think two very quick answer within 60 seconds will be there are two-layer responses. First layer is that, yeah, we welcome. In fact, the more the merrier. The more the merrier from US, from Quad, from any other countries. But the second layer, and that's a pragmatic layer, is that we would even attracted and closer to it when we see it, right? So depending on how soon we actually see it in front of us, if you're going to take like until 2021, then
not as much.
We are, and that affect many other things as well.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time. Alina or Cheng-Chwee, do either of you have a closing remark that you would like to make to our audience?
I think maybe that the last word honor should go to our friend Elena.
Just really quickly, 2 points. One, I really like Cheng-Chwee's use of the word motif, and Anne-Marie talked about values as kind of a binder for the bilateral relationship. I think there is a difference, obviously a distinction between rhetoric. Both countries talk about democracy and rule of law. The US talks a lot about rules-based order. The reality is that both countries have actually fallen far short of those ideals. And so it's a motive that we often use to tie ourselves to each other, but I think more discerning and perhaps even cynical eyes would see things a little differently. And secondly, I think really with regard to the Quad, I think there was great hope that the Quad was going to live up to more than just an anti-China grouping. But now with troubles in India, India was supposed to be really the supply source of those vaccines. It seems that the Quad may be slightly already in trouble. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming. I want to remind you that next Thursday, May 6th at 8 o'clock, our conference series will shift to Cambodia. We'll have a presentation by Dr. Chung Benarith and Leng Terith entitled Cambodia-US Relations in the New Era. And our discussant will be Kosal Path of Brooklyn College. I want to thank Srinith Pool, who is behind the scene making this all happen. And last but not least, I really want to thank our two speakers tonight for their really deep and rich dive into Malaysian-US relations. Dr. Cheng-Chwee Kuik, Alina Noor, thank you very much for coming. I learned an awful lot. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.